nations are defined by their borders and by the central font of power, which is the state. Gandhi is not interested in either of these two categories. He thinks in civilizational terms. So he is often asked, what is India? And his answer, which for most people is a non sequitur, is he says, there is India in South Africa. There is India in East Africa. There is India in the Persian Gulf.
We typically start with a question on personal and intellectual biography or a short bio of an invited scholar, just to understand what was your inspirations, what was your milestones during your personal and intellectual journey.
I'm Indian. I come from India. My schooling, for the most part, was in India. Then I went to school in England for 2 years. After that, I came to America. I came to a college called Swarthmore. I studied philosophy and mathematics there. And then I got my PhD at Princeton. After that, I taught at Princeton for 2 years. Then I taught at Cornell for 3 years.
Okay.
Then I moved to MIT for, 7 years. Then I moved to Chicago for 3 years.
Any kind of inspirations or any kind of influences that you have had?
I used to be a Marxist. And then after I graduated from college, I realized that I could only be a Marxist by being dishonest to myself. Because, I come from a upper middle class family, and I've had privileges all my life. It's not as though, as a privileged person, I should not have been a Marxist, but there is some tension there. I could feel that tension. This coincided with my arrival in graduate school at Princeton, and I had come there. In the end, it was a choice between Harvard and Princeton, and I picked Princeton. I picked Princeton because at that time, my principal interest was philosophy of mathematics. Because I majored in mathematics, I felt I could study it. After taking a few courses in philosophy of mathematics, I realized I just was not smart enough for it. I moved to this program called the Program in Political Philosophy, which at Princeton gave you more or less full access to 5 departments: philosophy, classics, history and politics. And I started working with this guy called Richard Rorty, who was in the philosophy department. And in politics, I had this advisor called Sheldon Wolin. Both were quite distinguished, and
your disillusionment with Marxism was only on personal level, or was it something related to intellectual thing as well?
No, it's a very good question. Looking back, for the most part, it was personal. And at the same time, my philosophic regard for Marx didn't abate. So, to this day, I think of him as a very, very important thinker. I disagree with him on many things, but I disagree with many thinkers. The tension I felt was between my personal life and my philosophic positions. And to the extent that I've resolved that.
Your works have generated a lot of interest and curiosity in Indian academia over the years, particularly the recent writings which are more India-centric, including on Gandhi. So, we find a very interesting shift and also some connectivity, if we take a whole host of writings over the years which you have produced. You started with Anxiety of Freedom. I think it was pure, in political philosophy. You operated purely in political philosophy. Then you shifted, to Liberalism and Empire, which one can say that partly theory, partly history, partly India. And then later on we discovered that you came out with some very imaginative and path-breaking work on Indian constitutionalism. And then recently we have seen that you are basically moving to Gandhi in a big way. So how do you explain this, these shifts and to some extent connectivity that from pure political philosophy you have shifted to constitutionalism and
Yes.
Gandhi?
So in my head, there is a connection. One of the central claims in my first book on Locke was that Locke exaggerates how easy it is to be a liberal. And I was uncomfortable with that. What I have in mind is Locke takes notions like freedom and equality and rationality as being self-evident. And then I realized that almost every liberal from Locke onwards had written about imperialism and colonization. And as a general matter, liberals and socialists were pro-empire. The one person who was not, who at that time I knew, was Edmund Burke. And he, as I think you must know, is commonly designated as a conservative. So I was struck by this, apparent. And then as I studied this, I realized that the way for Burke to resolve this tension had to do with my initial discomfort with Locke. The way he resolved it was by saying, first of all, things like freedom, equality should not be thought of as universal because they abstract from actual circumstances. For other people, circumstances don't matter. For me, they are crucial. I liked that sentence because it captured my discomfort with thinkers like Locke. Circumstances did not play any role, as far as I could see, in Locke's theory. So he settled the issue of freedom, equality at a very, very abstract level. In retrospect, it was the abstractness of this claim that troubled me. I had two questions in my head. Should one think of things like freedom in this abstract way? The second was the specific puzzle of why, as a general matter, were liberals and socialists imperialists. And I saw the resolution in a thinker like Burke, because he was neither abstract nor was he an imperialist. Burke was the only distinguished thinker of the 18th century who was a consistent critic of the empire in Ireland and in America.
Later also in India,
Yeah,
particularly
yeah, yeah,
from Warren Hastings and other.
yeah. I mean, in the standard edition, Burke's writings add up to 14 volumes. 6.5 of those deal with India. So I was drawn to Burke for those reasons. I mean, there were other reasons why I was drawn to him. He writes the English language very well. He's a great speech giver, etc. So where does Gandhi fit in all this? So Gandhi, I think, fits in the fact that, on my view, I know this is not the standard view. Gandhi, I don't think, thinks in abstract terms. So even his idea of nonviolence, it's not anchored in any principle of nonviolence. And in Gandhi's case, it's the relevant context, in my view, is individuals' makeup. And there's a specific thing that Gandhi thinks is very important in the individual. It is courage, patience, and the way I understand Gandhi is that the reason why he values these things is precisely because he thinks that Swaraj is a pun. It has two meanings, at least in in Hindi and Sanskrit. It means self-government, which is what the common nationalists, and it means self-rule. I think Gandhi thought the self-rule was a precondition for self-government. And what did self-rule involve? It involved self-discipline, not having fear, having courage, being patient. So if you think of the activities most commonly associated with Gandhi's public life, things like spinning, khadi, silence, these are all activities that are meant to give people self-confidence. None of these have a significant product. And I was drawn to that. I was drawn to that. The common nationalist, or the run-of-the-mill nationalist, value security. I think Gandhi doesn't value. And it's this security, it's his lack of concern with security that leads him to be a critic of the centralized state. Because what the centralized state, what in its self-conception it offers people is, apart from the nation itself, which I don't think Gandhi is interested in that. Why is he not interested in that? Because nations are defined by their borders and by the central font of power, which is the state. Gandhi is not interested in either of these two categories. He thinks in civilizational terms. So he is often asked, what is India? And his answer, which for most people is a non sequitur, is he says, there is India in South Africa. There is India in East Africa. There is India in the Persian Gulf. And if you imagine the look on the person's face who was asking him these questions, it would be puzzled. It would be, he or she asked him, what is India? And he says, there is India in these various places. Why does he say that? I think he says that because he doesn't care about the question of where India ends, where it begins, to go on to speak about my interest in constitutionalism. As you must know, Gandhi reluctantly, I mean, he did in the end bless the Constituent Assembly, but he says somewhere, the Indian Constitution is about the future, and the Constituent Assembly is discussing the future. What I most care about is the present.
Yeah.
And I take that comment to be a certain indifference about what are the frameworks through which a country is governed. So think of that as the answer to the question, what should the self-government of India be?
Look like.
And I don't think Gandhi is that interested in self-government. He's interested in self-rule. And therefore, I don't think he's interested in the process of constitutional forming.
Very interesting. One thing before I move to a little bit more on Gandhi, on this constitutionalism, I'm struck by one fact that in recent decades, 3 decades, I have observed that whole host of political theorists have started writing and theorizing constitutionalism, not only in India, but in other places also. And we are reminded of the classical liberal thought when all eminent thinkers reflected on law and the constitution. But then later on, could be because of under the spell of American behavioralism and other things, it was either left to the legal jurists or political theorists didn't engage with this issue. But in recent times, again, we are finding this revival of this interest in constitutionalism. which is very refreshing, particularly if we look at India's Constituent Assembly and debates.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there were some path-breaking work earlier, but not from the same vantage point with which the scholars are perhaps approaching it now.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find this interesting shift in scholarship on constitutionalism?
I have a very flat-footed answer to this question. I think it is a kind of arrogance in that these people believe that constitutions are the core of society. I'm struck, if they're the core of society, then, you bring a bunch of smart lawyers around the table and you can produce constitutions, which is what happened, following 1989, when all of these new countries became independent. And, there was American lawyers were an export commodity. They were busy writing constitutions. A good friend of mine who teaches at NYU, Stephen Holmes, he participated in the writing of, the constitutions of Hungary and Czech Republic or something. So coming back to what I said earlier, constitutions, in my view, have lost their connection with the mode of living. And that's why I think they have proliferated. Somebody can ask me, legitimately, do you think societies can exist without constitutions? I don't think so. I don't even think Gandhi thought so. But the point I'm trying to get across is that constitutions are, for them to be credible, they have to engage with the circumstances of a place. They can't operate at 1,000 feet above the ground. They're not exportable.
We have seen a lot of debates in recent times on the nature of Indian constitutionalism, whether it is a liberal document or not.
Yes.
And if I place your writing, where I remember at one place you have written that Hobbes should be considered the unacknowledged mentor of Indian constitution, because the way security, order, and other things dominate the entire discourse, national unity and other things. And individual freedom, of course, was there, but not as prominent as these concerns. And then we have also scholars like Khilnani and others who have argued that it was done in a fit of absent-mindedness, and kind of reports got from scholars like Rajiv Bhargav and others who have tried to establish that no, it was a well considered decision, it's a liberal document and all that. Now, if we place this entire debate in the light of this term which occurs on the very first page, we the people, particularly in terms of the sovereignty, where it lies, there is no ambiguity. Then we find that there is a historical context of incorporation of this, this term, this usage, this phrase. That is basically the bourgeois revolutions of 19th century, 18th century, be it the France or United States of America. But if we do a comparative study, then we find that neither the bourgeois revolution took place in India on the same pattern, nor the members of the Constituent Assembly had any confusion on this count, because they hardly ever use the term revolution, transfer of power and other things. But still they preferred using the term we the people on pattern of this standard norm which had been set after the first written constitution was drafted in the United States of America.
Yes.
And interestingly, the people.
Let me just interrupt you. So the first three words of both the constitutions, the American and the Indian, are the same.
Very, yeah. And On the other hand, if we find the presence of these people in the Constituent Assembly, we the people, because there was no, bourgeois revolution, and therefore even the revolutionaries who could have claimed that they were representing the will of the people, they were in the assembly. There was nothing of that sort, and we have seen a lot of writings on this. The class character of the Constituent Assembly, mostly middle class, educated elites, a limited franchise, and all that. How do you look at this thing in context of Indian constitution?
Was the Constitution a document that was designed to create a nation? So is the statement, we the people, just in 1950, was this, did this represent Indian idealism? Were we a people prior to that? I don't think we were a people prior to that. We weren't a unified people. We were a bunch of diversities. So I mean, take the issue of language. We didn't have a common language. Take the issue of economics. I mean, we were such a, the level of inequality was enormous. Take the issue of literacy. Even back in 1950, I think I'm right in saying 85% of the adults of India were illiterate. Now, could you have a nation with this kind of profile? I don't think so. I mean, regional identities were so pronounced. India at that time had these 538 ruling families. I don't think most of them felt they were Indian. They were, I come from Rajasthan, I come from Udaipur, Mewar, which is, Udaipur is the capital of Mewar, they thought they were an independent principality, and so I think the task of the nationalists, the first task of the nationalists, was to get a sense of unity into this country, and the Constitution was the document through which they tried to do this. So to reformulate one thing, I think the statement, we the people, embodies a kind of idealism, which was at that time a substitute for the actual reality. So, when you look at America, and when the Constitution was formulated in America, 1787, and it starts with the same word, we the people. At that time, America had 13 states. Everyone spoke the same language. Everyone, for the most part, was from the same religion. And, there wasn't any mass poverty here. It made sense to talk about we the people. The one group of people who this idea of we the people in America excluded was the blacks. I don't think back then they counted for much other than human beings,
Yeah, in fact, recently I was, listening to one of your lectures on YouTube on democracy, where you, have posed for 5, ambiguities or infirmities in the entire liberal discourse on democracy. And one issue which you have flagged there is this we the people. And then you have added that is it not proper to now start believing modestly we the peoples. So what I got from that statement from yours that perhaps you are saying that it's only in the name of the people. That is perhaps the essence of representative democracy
Yeah.
and the liberal democracy. So
Yeah.
no point unnecessarily befooling ourselves is the we the people who basically in this democracy rule.
Yeah.
And if I compare this observation, rather in fact if I look at this observation of yours with the last speech Ambedkar delivered on the Constituent Assembly, I'm reminded of his statement when he said that democracy, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Mhm.
And if it becomes only of the people and for the people, then perhaps this entire edifice which you have created may not be quite sustainable.
Yeah.
In spite of being a liberal to the core,
Yeah.
who had strong reservations on the Gandhian Swarajist politics,
Yes.
perhaps complemented the Constituent Assembly for discarding many Gandhian principles in politics, including
Yeah.
the Satyagraha and other things. But when perhaps he was talking like this, perhaps he was also at somewhere he also had this inkling that this type of representative democracy finally would rob the people of their sovereignty, in whose name perhaps they are working.
Yeah.
So how do you basically look at this new phenomenon? And that's why this recent upsurge against this representative model of politics,
Yeah.
all over, including India, in fact, is pointed to that fact.
Ambedkar's constitutional vision was the right one. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, as I believe Gandhi would have thought, it was far too statist. It believed that, or he believed that the state was the principal agent of reform. He is the one who introduced the idea of the directive principle. I think he got it from Ireland, the Irish Constitution. But the directive principles, or affirmative action as it's called here, the state was meant to do the uplift. The state was meant to lift up these people, the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes. I don't think that was the right way to go. Even though there are other parts of Ambedkar that I really admire. I think the fact that he was for universal adult franchise, unconditional, without any conditions. All you had to be was human, and you had the vote. I don't think any other country started with universal adult franchise. So, I mean, that part, I respect of him, and I suspect Gandhiji would have respected that of him. But Gandhiji would have opposed the role of the state that Ambedkar advocated.
I mean, just one clarification. You said that we believe that what Ambedkar proposed was the ideal constitution. I would just like to clarify that I will humbly argue that the ideal constitution for a society like India uh, could be where perhaps the Gandhian Satyagraha type politics cohabits with the kind of liberal institutional design for which Ambedkar worked. So a combination of two, could be the ideal for Indian situation. So I think that unfortunately, the second part, this Gandhian Satyagraha politics, how it can be accommodated within the broad liberal democratic framework, I think perhaps the Constituent Assembly didn't, dwell on this issue. That will be my submission.
I agree with you. So I think that what the Constituent Assembly did was set out the framework of the state. And what it ignored was precisely what I think Gandhi was interested in, satyagraha. Satyagraha, as I understand it, was in the main the idea that individuals have to prepare themselves for democracy.
Yeah, so just to add up to the discussion, what Satish sir was also asking about, we the people.
Yeah.
So what we have been seeing in contemporary times, in contemporary India in particular, that this idea of we the people is somehow being trying to disfigured by the ruling dispensations, be it Congress or the BJP. Like, they try to disfigure it in their own ways. One of the thing can be like exclusion of minorities from the imagination of the ruling dispensation. The another is the issue of national register of citizens. So these things, when you see these things, you believe that there is some kind of urge of state. Is it the urge of state which is Hobbesian in nature, or is it simply a junctural that which is temporary and which might go with the change in the ruling dispensation? How would you reflect on, a philosopher would reflect on it? Yes.
The contemporary government in India uh, believes that the basis of governance has to be it has to be pure, can't include foreign elements, and
Mm,
therefore the only grounds on which foreign elements can be part of India is as guests. And that was Jinnah's view of Pakistan. He said Hindus are welcome here,
exactly.
but as second class citizens. They can't be full fledged citizens. And I think that's what this government is saying. Muslims are welcome here. I don't even think it says that, but they can stay, but only as guests. That's my view. That's my view. And I think the National Register and the CAA,
Constitutional Amendment Act. Yeah.
yeah, I think in their idealized form, there are ways of purifying the country because the government doesn't think that this is the it does not believe that India should have any taints in it. And it views, I don't think it views Muslims in the same way as it views smaller minorities like Parsis, like Christians, because, though it might at some point view them in similar ways. But it views Muslims as these are various. I mean, to put it in the best form I can, these are various gimmicks. I mean, I think the word gimmick is harsh. Yeah, there are various ways in which to make the nation purer.
mm,
One is related to again Gandhi,
Mhm.
particularly this ethical side of politics, which also you seem to be now highlighting in your writings.
Yes,
Perhaps
yes.
a book length work perhaps is now available. Uh, and one thing here, I'm struck by this aspect in politics, democratic politics, contemporary Indian democratic politics. Particularly, I was reading one of your pieces where you talk about, everyday life, ethics in everyday life,
Yeah,
which Gandhi tried to highlight through his
yeah,
politics, be it
yeah,
his ashramite discourse or outside ashramite.
yeah.
And it is here, perhaps, I think that both the left and the liberals, I think that flounder, particularly this ethics in everyday life.
Yes, yes,
Politics is only seen as something which is a meta event or meta narrative,
yes, yes.
not day to day politics. and how
Yes.
it can be basically intertwined with this ethical norms and ethical core. And it is here perhaps Gandhi, scores a point on both ideologies, the left and liberals. Of course, in fact, I'm reminded of Marx's famous writing, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, where he has basically whole discourse on it.
Yes.
And but nonetheless, when it comes to the actual practice of politics
Yeah.
in the left communist movement,
Yeah.
we find that they suffer from this handicap,
Yes.
either in terms of the secrecy of politics, the concept of core group in their organizations, which basically eliminates the participation of the masses in
Yes.
whose name they do politics, or in other spheres also. So therefore, on paper, they might have, and Marx might have, theorized this ethics, but in practice, this ethical aspect is missing. When we
Yes.
come to the liberal discourse, what we find that institutional design and ethics of that institutional design, which basically underwrote those institutions, it was fondly hoped that that would compensate for this type of ethics into everyday politics. But that has not happened.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that it is here perhaps this disenchantment of masses with the representative politics,
Mhm.
this entire popularity of the leaders who often talk about intentions, not policies. When Narendra Modi says that my policies might have gone wrong, but my niyat is clean, I think that people perhaps are carried away by such a
Mm.
statement.
Mm.
So, how do you look at the future of democratic politics in terms of this Gandhian ethical discourse coming into play?
I like your question. I mean, I think, I mean, you know my work so well. So I think you probably would not be surprised by my answer, which is a Burkean answer, where Burke says politics is the principles of morality enlarged. And I think democracies often forget that. So they think that ethics or morality is just for bourgeois societies. And I think it's not. It's not just for bourgeois societies. Now, since you bring up Marx's 1844 manuscripts, I think that's where Marx has a conception of ethics. I mean, that has become my favorite piece of Marx's writing, because the idea of ethics is so conspicuous.
I'll just wrap up by the last query. Uh, in fact, we started with Burke, and in fact, I'd like to end with Burke because I'm reminded of the colonial period when a lot of interesting writings, ideas, debates were taking place, both among Indians as well as among the rulers, British rulers. And normally we have read them as the debate between the Anglicists and the Orientalists.
Mm-hmm.
And Burke perhaps is often referred as perhaps the high priest of this Orientalist discourse at that time. But what we are finding today, and of course, the kind of response, and the kind of support the Anglicists got among Indians, particularly in freedom movement, Ram Mohan Roy and others, the entire utilitarian discourse, Macaulay and others, the way wholeheartedly they supported. So that was, of course, but later on in 20th century, of course, we find that generated a reaction also, particularly starting with this, this Tilak and others, and later on, of course, Gandhi also picked up the thread. In recent, decades, we have seen a school of thought emerging in social science, literature, everywhere, post-colonialism. And that post-colonialism, interestingly, is basically working with some of the premises which at that time were being peddled by the Orientalists about some sort of exceptionalism, Indian exceptionalism. But I think with the difference that they turned the East into object, and the post-colonialists are turning the East into subject in the manner where that binary is not demolished, the basically subject-object binary. The West becomes the object now. The East
mm,
becomes the subject.
mm,
So, in fact, and therefore, this post-colonialism, which had, basically very good response in the academia in the beginning, now scholars are arguing that it is nothing but reverse Orientalism.
mm.
That basically it has turned only the argument for this thing. How do you look at this? And interestingly, these post-colonialists have, tried to, I will not say appropriate Gandhi, but sometimes they, base their entire argument on the Gandhian, discourse. So, how would you look at this?
I do think there's some truth in the fact that post colonialists have flipped the subject object thing. Uh, I don't know how serious that is, um, or if it's just a way station for having a more equal dialogue in which power relations disappear. So, let me give you an example. In the last chapter of Hind Swaraj, Gandhi says something like the following: You English have not sent your best to us, and we Indians have not sent our best to you. And in this paragraph, he concludes it by saying, if you English want to have a better dialogue with us, we both have to anchor our relationship in a religious soil. Those are his words. So he thinks this idea of self-betrayal, which then for him leads to a distorted conversation, that both things can be rectified only by planting the relationship in a religious soil. Now, this idea of a religious soil is I think it's very different than looking for an overlapping consensus. We have to, as it were, we, the Indians, have to go back to our own traditions. You, the English, have to go back to your own traditions. And then we can talk. I find that to be compelling.